Welcome to the webinar. We are so excited you could join us today for this webinar provided by the Nevada Department of Education as part of the Nevada Digital Learning Collaborative Initiative. If you haven't heard of this initiative, I'm so excited to introduce it to you. It is a statewide initiative here in the state of Nevada to provide resources to our educators, administrators, parents, and even our students as we move to digital learning. Today, we will be focusing on the beginning part of that process, which is getting ready to go digital. Our goal for this webinar is really to provide you, the listener, with 7 tips to walk away with to help in your digital adventure. Now, if you're already experienced with digital learning, please don't walk away, stay right here. We're really hoping you will use this webinar as a checklist, a reflection on your practices that you've already put in place, and plan your next steps for your blended learning environment. I am so excited to introduce myself to you. My name is Audra Armand Richardson, and I have the honor of being a math strategist at one of our elementary schools here in Clark County School District. I'm also a blended learning teacher. I am starting my 6th year in blended learning, and I have just been in awe of all the changes that blended learning has brought to my personal life, but also to the lives of my students. This is not my first adventure with the Nevada Department of Education. I had the privilege of being a part of the Nevada Ready 21 grant, which brought one-on-one technology into our middle schools and provided professional development for our educators. And in fact, it's how I met my co-host and dear friend. I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to her to introduce herself.
Thank you, Audra. My name is Ingrid Johnson, and I am a project facilitator with the Online and Blended Learning Department in Clark County. I have worked with Audra in the NR21 initiative, working with Chromebooks in middle schools. In addition, I've taught online for NVLA and did some blending in their middle school as well. Before that, I was a digital learning coach, and before that, a face-to-face computer literacy teacher. So lots of interest and love for anything digital, and I'm excited to be here today. We're excited to kick off a year-long, month-by-month examination of Canvas LMS and other digital tips. And in this webinar, we will focus, like she said, on 7 specific tips for going digital. And we will pre-address some potential questions you may face in this process. I'd like to point out a practice of the eagle. Eagles demonstrate behaviors indicating that they are acutely aware when a storm is gathering. You know, perhaps they welcome the challenge it brings to be lifted by the winds above the clouds, where they can then rest and grow stronger. We too, as educators, collectively are responding to a situation in which we're unaccustomed, but know that we must face head on. Like the eagle, educators across the state of Nevada are embracing this new challenge by learning new skills and growing stronger. For Audra and I, it's an exciting thing to witness and be a part of, and we really, truly thank you for being here with us today. So through the use of this webinar and the monthly interactive infographics that we're going to be putting out, it is our goal to help you soar through the beginning steps of utilizing Canvas LMS with your digital classroom. So with that, Audra, as educators across the Silver State begin to consider their options in organizing a digital classroom, in what direction would you point them?
Well, we really want to start off by making a very important announcement, like a public service announcement. So see that flashing across your screen right now. And this is really rather a must-do than a tip. Please take the time to verify your permissions for your platforms and for your digital tools. So a platform would be like your learning management systems such as Google Classroom, for Canvas, for Schoology, and digital tools would be things like Quizzes, Kahoot, and Flipgrid. This is not a case where you want to ask for forgiveness later. Do this in advance. And the first step is to check with your district. Does your district have an approved list of platforms, devices, digital tools? Start there. See what your district wants you to be using. Then make sure you check in with your administrators. Your campus might be adopting a school-wide program, and I would really, really, really hate for you to invest all this energy into a platform that your school will not be using. So double check with your administrator. Always check the AUP, the acceptable use policy of your students. Make sure parents and guardians have given permissions. And this was a big deal in the spring when we suddenly had to jump to virtual learning. So double check what the parent guardian wishes are and work with your parents to really educate them on what that AUP means. And then you also need to check the terms of service for your tool. What are the age requirements? I know this is something I've run into in the past. Some tools are created for 13 and older, and I teach elementary, so I need to be cognizant of that before I start using a digital tool in my classroom. Make sure you're adhering to those FERPA and COPA guidelines regarding data collection. Now, if FERPA and COPA are new to you, if you've not heard those terms before, or you're not clear on those regulations, you're going to need to do a little research, and a great place to start is by talking to your instructional leader on your campus. They can give you the information and point you in the right direction.
Wow, that's a lot to consider.
You know, it really is, but we are not going to leave our listeners high and dry. We really want to introduce them to this tool through Common Sense Media. And if you haven't heard of Common Sense Media, please bookmark them now. This is a great digital resource that provides you with media reviews for both families and educators just like us. The site reviews EdTech technology. It gives you the pros, the cons, an inside look at the tools that you're considering. It gives you reviews regarding engagement, pedagogical practices, support, and even privacy. And that's so important when we're thinking about, does a app or tool have ads in it, or is there data mining? And we really want to walk you through this process. So I'm going to go ahead and navigate to this Common Sense Media page. And I really want to show you what it looks like to use this website. So again, we're on Common Sense Media. We're under this EdTech reviews, and we're looking at reviewing a tool. So once I'm in here, I'm going to go ahead. Oops, so sorry about that. And we're going to type in the name of a tool. And I'm going to go ahead and use Book Creator. That's a tool I know we use on my school site. So oops, I even misspelled it. Let's see if it catches it or not. No, wait, there we go, second one. So even if I spell it wrong, it still shows up. So it preliminary gives you some information right here. The thing that I think is most important is this privacy rating right here. Pay attention to that, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. So I'm gonna go ahead and click on this tool and show you some of the things to pay attention to. So again, gives me some preliminary ratings, that privacy rating, really important. It tells you the grade levels it feels it's appropriate for, talks about the content areas you could use this with. Here's that inside look I was talking about. So before you even download this, you can take a look at what the program looks like. Here's those pros, cons, the bottom line, because we all want to know, just give it to me. Bottom line, it talks about how you can use this tool, what is it, and is it good for learning? And what I also enjoy about this is it includes reviews, if you scroll down a little farther, from real educators. So I'm hearing from other teachers who have used this, how they feel about that. If I scroll back up, you'll see those ratings for engagement, pedagogy, and support that I talked about before. And if I keep going, here's that privacy rating section. And I think this is so important. It talks about how safe the product is, what rights do you have for the data, and those advertisements and tracking. If it has a check mark by it, it means you're in the green on that. And if there's a caution sign, that's something you want to be aware of, or that information is not available. I think this is so helpful for our educators, administrators, and even our parents as we talk about what tools we're using in the classroom.
I really appreciate this, Audra, because as a parent, I can see the rationale for tool use, but then I really like the idea that there's been some investigating, how it's going to affect my student, my child, and that the teacher's already taken a look at that. So we have permission. Where do we go from there?
Okay, well, now I want you to date your program, Ingrid.
So that's a great analogy. Let's let our listeners in on the history of that.
This is a really great analogy, and it comes from our former director that both Ingrid and I worked under in the online and blended learning department in Clark County School District, and our esteemed blended learning guru, Kim Loomis. If you haven't heard of her, I highly suggest you look her up. But Ingrid, before we can let him in on the secret, I have to ask you a personal question. Are you ready?
Okay.
Did you marry the first person that you dated?
No, that would not have worked.
Exactly. And I have to admit, I did not either. And the reason we're bringing up the dating process is because we put a lot of energy into it to get to know someone as our prospective partner. What do we love about them? And then what do we have to live with, work with, make allowances for? And our digital platform is just like that. We have to date or get to know our learning platform and tools. So what can that platform or tool do for you? What are that platform or tool's limitations? You have to make the time, just like we do with dating, to get to know your learning platform or the tool that you're using. And as educators, we are so bad at this. And I get it. I really do. We don't have time. And I understand that. But this is a step that I would say we cannot afford to skip.
I love that. So how do you suggest an educator, truly get started?
So I suggest you click everything. Just click everything. Students are so good at this. They investigate. They want to know what every single button on their dashboard does. So be like your students. I am in awe that some of my students will spend hours watching YouTube videos or getting in chats to figure out how to pass a level in a game that they are invested in. We need to have just as much energy put into our learning platform or tools. Take a note from our students. Make the time to get to know the tool. What do all the buttons do? How can this platform help our education? And remember, you can't break it. So just keep clicking until you find what you want, and you will not be disappointed. So Ingrid, we have permissions. Now we know our platform. We've dated it. Where should we go from here? What should we be thinking about next?
Okay, so next, tip number 2 is to model or teach the behavior you want your students to follow and use in your digital class. So students and parents may notice details or may not, as you know, but know that it's there. They can review, rewatch, and see everything that you've put in type. So take into account the tone and possible perception of everything that you do put in your digital classroom. And also consider the following when communicating. Is it polite? Is it positive? And is it professional? So with that in mind, let's examine several areas in which we will need to provide a model or a how-to for our students. So first of all, modeling logistics. How to log in, using the calendar, seeing where due dates are, how to post a comment, use the inbox, reach the teacher, turn in an assignment, consider posting a screencast so that your students can review the logistics and you don't have to repeat them over and over and over again. And when they forget, super simple, you point them to that screencast to review some of those logistics. Second thing, model how you would like your students to communicate. This includes in emails with you as well as with their peers. This allows your students to see what this interaction should look like, and hopefully going forward, they are communicating in a way that you will find effective as well as polite. And so you want to make sure your emails are showing them that. Also, model how you expect students to respond. So in regard to timeliness specifically. This can seem a challenge though, because as teachers, we don't have a lot of time, but it's crucial for our students to experience best practices in this area. So if we're going to set out, something in our expectations that are, 24-hour turnaround on responding to email questions and 48 hours or 72 hours on grading something, we want to make sure that we stick with that, whatever our guidelines are, so our students are able to see that we're modeling those best practices. And so when they're asked to turn something in on time or respond in a discussion or to an email themselves, they're following the same. So modeling is really important so that our students can see that we even, do what we are proposing that they do. So modeling timeliness. Next would be modeling exceptional feedback. In a digital environment, our students are going to be asked to provide feedback to their peers and also, to you. So by us consistently showing them how it's done, it's really important. In discussion forums, we can help move discussions forward by adding to a student's response or expanding on comments that they've already made. We have to really show them how to do this. In addition, our presence is helpful in maintaining a positive environment in discussion forums. So as we, throughout discussions, our comments, it will help our students to see that we're present and notice how we are communicating, and they will see that and hopefully model or do the same in their communication with others. So Audra, in the classroom, how can providing exemplary feedback on an assignment, such as recording your voice for a student and giving them feedback, or taking the time to type digital annotations on their digital papers, how can that be impactful modeling?
It just hits on a cornerstone of my own classroom, which is relationship building. And that is going to be so much more important when we're teaching virtually or from a distance, to really capitalize on moments to build relationships with our students. And I think, Ingrid, that's exactly what these ideas of audio feedback or even video feedback, or as you pointed out, those digital annotations, any way you can insert yourself into the course. I know you talked about threading. So putting yourself in those discussions to further them, to share part of who you are and your passion. That's why we're all here, right? We're passionate for teaching. Anything you can do to bring that into your comments, into your feedback, is so important to building those relationships. And that helps when you're providing that feedback you talked about, that coaching, that instruction. Think about it as just like in our classroom, we would sit down next to our student, or, come down and be next to them eye to eye up next to their desk, and really provide that one-on-one redirection or coaching or support. That's what this is when you're teaching from a distance. It's that moment within the course or within digital teaching to really be there for your kiddo. And it's so impactful for us to model what that looks like, because the more we insert ourselves and show them what that looks like, the more they're going to do that on their own. And I just want to point out why that's so important to model, going back, to the whole thing you started with, is, in our own classrooms, how many times do we have to tell kids to put their name on their paper? I mean, I know, Ingrid, you taught high school. I'm sure you had to tell a high schooler to put their name on their paper. Now, why is that? That's something they've been doing since kindergarten, right? But it's a process that they still need reminders for. And so the more we can remind them in the course what it means to have these positive interactions, the more they're going to pick up on our modeling and then do it for themselves. So I think this is a really important point that you're bringing out right here.
Great, thank you. That was truly significant to include. Here's a few more. So modeling how to complete an assignment. Provide examples, post them so students can come back to them if needed. When they're working in small groups, or in the instance of leading a group, this type of modeling will be important, as they can call back to how you provided the instruction, how you provided the directions, and how you provided an example for them. So students are watching everything that we're doing. And with that, some of you may be familiar with the book that Carol Dweck wrote about growth mindset. And with her research, she talks about a not yet classroom, where teachers create an environment where it's acceptable for students to make mistakes and to use those initial failures to learn more. And, really provide an experience where our students see that there's a growth opportunity there for them, that it's okay that they make mistakes. And if we can model this as well, this type of acceptance regularly during discussions or live sessions, the hope is that our students will see us allowing mistakes to be made, and that they too will not be so hard on their peers, allowing others time to grow. And they'll also feel more comfortable in making mistakes themselves, and looking at that as a growth opportunity when they come to your class. It's going to be engaging, it's going to be fun, and they're willing to put themselves out there and participate. There's so many more that we could include, but let's talk a little bit about setting expectations in our classes, and that's tip number 3. So with tip number 3, consider how your students will travel through your digital classroom. If you, the teacher, were a road sign in your digital class, what directions would you provide your students? So let's consider some of these larger areas when setting digital classroom expectations. Let's talk attendance for a minute. We have an in-person requirement for attendance in face-to-face school. So with the digital classroom, like perhaps our live sessions, what will that requirement be for your school or your class? Perhaps your district or your particular school site will make those requirements, or maybe you will. Just depending on what that is, make sure they're very transparent and clear to all students. Next, what are the participation expectations for your classroom? Once in the live session or enrolled in your digital course, how will you expect students to participate? Be very clear and give specifics when rolling this out. For example, muting microphones, using versus not using a webcam, setting up the environment free of distractions, etc. If you want your students to make a certain amount of contributions during a live session, tell them that number. Give them something to start with. If they exceed it, great, but give them something attainable, something they can reach. Let them in on what your expectations of them is in regard to participation, because at this point, this is all new to them, and we want to make sure that we're setting them up for success. Next, we move into behavior expectations for meeting digitally, and that kind of is the same as participation a little bit, but how should we expect our students to signal when they'd like to speak out loud during a live session? What would you like students to utilize, or would you like students to utilize the chat feature? If so, what will be appropriate for them to include in the chat? So what I mean by that is, for example, don't assume that a student will post in the chat, or for that matter, post something of substance to the lesson that you're giving without clarifying that expectation for this. Be really clear. Let your kids know that, hey, we're going to use the chat, but it's not to, use for shout outs during a live session when we're, doing a really engaging activity, or when we're doing, some direct instruction. I want to show you how to, do a math problem. Please don't use the chat for, saying hi to your friend that just entered late. You want to be really clear on the behavior expectations so that they understand them. Also, Audra, in the elementary level classroom, what additional expectations do you feel need to be discussed that will best help our youngest students?
You touched on so many that I use. If I can just share a slide that came from some of my live sessions that I have done during the spring closure, and you talked about just setting them up for success. So I always told my students, as you can see on this slide, what to bring to the meeting, to mute their microphone. Go ahead and get those hellos out. I love that you brought that out, because when a student walks in late to our classroom, the whole class doesn't stop and say hello. But for some reason in a virtual meeting, they think that they can do that. I'm so glad that you brought that up. So I try to get those hellos out at the beginning so that we can move on to other things. And I tell them what time we're going to start. Often I have kids come in early. And so this tells them exactly when we're going to start, that they're not late, that they're in the right place. And I think having a slide like this, just as you talked about, especially for our little kiddos, to come up to when it's in a virtual meeting would be really helpful. This is also something you can post in your Canvas course about your expectations. But it also really connected with that idea you talked about earlier, Ingrid, about screencasting and giving a model, going back to step number 2, of what they should be doing, and have those videos available for students to come back to and families to come back to about the behaviors we want to see. We need repetition, going back to that whole name on the paper pencil illustration. Like, we need those reminders and chunking things. I think that's another big important thing to talk about with our younger kiddos, is making sure our videos, our meetings, anything that we're doing is age appropriate for their attention span. So chunking things into smaller, swallowable bites is really important. And making sure that our live sessions and our content online is engaging. Have some active learning going on. Make sure we're keeping our kiddos' attention. You know, I know how I feel staring at a screen all day when there's nothing exciting going on. So let's make sure that that's not how our kiddos feel about our classroom, and never underestimate the need for a good brain break. You know, if you're doing a live session and you see your kiddos are tuning out, do the same thing you would have done in your classroom. You would have bring up the energy. You would have had everybody stretch. The same thing you want to do in your digital classroom. You know, bring that energy back. Throw in an activity. Let's take a brain break. Do a TikTok dance. Not me, because you don't want to see that. But you get the idea. Take it a moment to re-engage the kiddos in the material, and I think you'll find that that will work really well.
Okay, this is a great ad, and I love this graphic. I think this is really eye-catching, and the kids are going to definitely read what's on there and, you know what to do, first steps when they enter that session. So thank you for sharing that. Not only do we need to always consider communicating expectations we have for our students, but also how we set them up for success and following our expectations. And this is a great example.
Exactly. And I have some additional ideas on how we can take that a bit further. We're looking into the settings that we use with our students and how they interact with the course through their eyes. So this tip number 4, actually comes from my favorite Google duo. This is Matt Miller and Casey Bell's idea. If you haven't heard of them, they're from the Google Teacher Tribe podcast. I follow them, and I highly recommend that you do also. And in one of their recent podcasts, they highlighted the idea about using Student View, that feature, or even creating a student account so that you can see things from a student perspective. And I have to admit, I don't know why this didn't dawn on me before. Maybe it's just the way that they put it, but really taking a look at how our students are interacting with the digital tool or platform that we're using. So often things do look just a little bit different, or things are even placed in a different location when in Student View. And we need to be aware of that for that modeling. Going back to step 2, again, Ingrid, that was a really important one you had. Features may also not be in a student mode. So you need to look for that before you start training them on something. Or if you set up permissions, such as maybe you want to have a moderator mode or you want to disable comments, looking in Student View can be a great way to make sure that those controls are turned on correctly, the way you want them to be before you start an activity. So I often create a student account. Oh my gosh, Ben's going to kill me for telling this, but I often create a student account in my husband's name. Sorry, Ben, I love you. Just so I can take a look at what things look in my classroom. He's been on my class dojo every year, so he gets all my student announcements. But it's really important for me to know that things are working, to see what my parents and kiddos are interfacing with. And I just think it's really important to be supportive, that we have to know what it looks like through their eyes.
Wow, that's a really good idea, is making that account so that you can see both sides of it, the teacher side and the student side. So do you know, though, if all platforms have that ability?
You know what? That is a really good point. And not every tool and not every platform will let you do that. So I think that really goes back to tip number 1. Look at us being so efficient here. But really getting to know your platform. Take a look at all the options that are available. See if this is an option that you can use. Or if not, see if you can create a student account. It may not always be possible, but I think it's a good first step in getting to know your program and taking a look at things from your student perspective.
Okay, great. it hadn't occurred to me to think about the student experience versus my own until we started talking about this a little bit more and more. But going, away from this, I'm always going to look at both sides of this, really carefully, because I think going forward, we want to make sure that our students are, set up for success, and that they're comfortable with the directions we're giving them and they make sense. So great ads.
So that brings us to our next tip. As I mentioned, tip number 4 came to me through Matt Miller and Casey Bell, who I subscribe to. I'm a part of their podcast group. And that's exactly what we want educators to do with tip number 5, and that is to collaborate. We really want to encourage everyone who's listening to create a PLN, a professional learning network.
So I know most of our listeners are familiar with a PLC, but I really think we should dive a little bit deeper into what a PLN is.
No, I think you're right. So a PLN, again, is a professional learning network, and it's really a group of educators, bloggers, podcasters that you follow. This can be subject-based, it can be grade level based, or it can just be anybody related to education. These are your gurus, your go-tos. It's really your digital support system. And I think this is so important, especially if we are going to be fully online, that we have a digital support system, a digital network to go to for support when we can't collaborate with our peers on a day-to-day basis. And, a great place to start is on Twitter. Now, Ingrid, I know you're not the biggest fan of Twitter, but it is really a good place to start. Another good place to start is Facebook. Facebook has so many educator groups that you can join. I have to admit, I'm in a Canvas group for elementary teachers. I'm in a group that's for teachers during COVID group. I'm in a math for elementary group. I'm even in a 5th grade teachers group.
Wow, you're in a lot.
I know I am. I go a little overboard in this area, but you know me, that's typical for me. But I have to tell our listeners why. And that's really because I love to see what other educators are doing. I really want to know what issues that they're facing. And I love knowing that some of the things that I'm experiencing, some of the difficulties I'm having, are the same things that they're experiencing. But more importantly, I love that we have this collaborative group to come to get solutions and help me overcome and adapt to some of the obstacles that I am facing.
Okay, so how would you tell people to get started with this?
That's a good question. On social media, I really recommend that you follow hashtags. Good hashtags for me are things like blended learning or virtual teaching. I also highly suggest that you follow your learning platform or the digital tools that you're using. This makes sure that you get the latest and greatest information that gets released on updates or upcoming features. So that's helpful. If your learning platform has a YouTube channel, subscribe, please subscribe. Google for Education is always releasing new videos on their tools and tricks. And that's how I found out about the new updates that are coming to Google Meet. So making sure you're subscribing to those YouTube channels can also be helpful.
Okay, great. And I know that another thing that you do is that you're an active listener to podcasts. So tell me more about how that fits in with this.
Yes, I am a huge podcaster, guilty as charged. But when I used to commute to work, it was really good to put on a podcast and get that little PD before I walked into a building. Or, when I take a walk at night, I like to put in a podcast, and it really helps, take my mind off the exercise that I need to do. But it's a really great way to get some information and change my frame of mind. A new one I started listening to is called the Canvas Casters. They have some great tips for how to utilize Canvas. So we need to stay informed. We need to know what's going on in the education world. But Ingrid, we're not the only people who need to stay up to date. So that brings us to tip number 6.
Thanks, Audra. Tip number 6, which is keeping our parents in the loop. The digital learning experience is going to be new to you, your students, but also your students' parents. And they are going to want to know how to engage as well. So some thoughts in doing so include many things that you already do in your face-to-face classroom. So let's think about that. At the beginning of the school year, you will send out a welcome letter. This new welcome letter should also be sent out digitally. It should include things either in the letter or in the course expectations about how your classroom is going to run. What should parents expect in terms of, what time your students are going to be expected to meet weekly on, live sessions, when your office hours are and how to reach you. Those types of things are going to shift a little bit because now there's another way for them to interact with you, and that is digitally. So include those types of things in your welcome letter. Also, be very positive about the changes that are happening. It's really different for everybody, including you, of course. We're not all used to teaching completely digitally or in a blended type situation or 2 days a week or whatever the case may be. Just be as positive as possible and help walk your families through the situation. They'll really appreciate it. And you will be providing the tone for the year. Next, provide course expectations and a syllabus just like you would in the face-to-face classroom, but make these things digital and post them in a static place within your online course. Make sure parents have access to join the course using a parent account. Oftentimes our registrars or people in the front office, whoever might be tasked with that, will be handling those things, but I guarantee you will get some parents who will reach out to you because either they don't know who to reach out to in the front office or they need additional help. It will be really, really beneficial for you to kind of understand that process for the parents and signing up and having those types of things ready to go and available to the parents. Oftentimes in our schools, it would be really great if we could look a little bit more to creating some peak experiences for our parents, kind of like Disneyland does, right? We stand in line at Disneyland out in the heat for hours at a time, sometimes to ride a ride. But we're very forgiving of the situation because we might have a peak experience in some small way in another, situation at the park. So maybe somebody, provided assistance to you or, something special was done. And we remember that peak experience and we take it home with us. And that was how we kind of framed our experience there. So if we can kind of do some extra things and supports for our parents, hopefully they'll remember, that as being a peak experience, dealing with things that have been changed, in your classroom or at the school. And hopefully it'll help them feel a little bit more at ease as well. Give your parents resources such as directions in PDF form or as a screencast. Those screencasted how-tos are very effective for parents as well. And those are helpful to parents of, our younger students as well as our older students. So parents will watch those. They will look for, your assistance with, those types of directions and getting logged in, like we talked with the logistics earlier, to even doing certain assignments that have multiple steps. So take that into consideration when looking at the scope of the things that you need to provide your parents in your digital classroom. Also, K through 12, consider posting a weekly announcement explaining what is coming up in the digital class or your face-to-face class. If you are no longer the sage on the stage and now are the guide on the side, be sure to be the best guide possible and leave no one behind. Let them know what's going on in the class, keep them, up to date, and I think it'll really alleviate a lot of questions and uncertainties that parents might be having. As a former online teacher, something that I practiced all the time was keeping a phone log and reaching out to parents of students who have missing assignments on a weekly basis. That may seem like a lot to you, but it was a practice I found to be very worth my time. And if I kept up on it, it generally meant that more and more students were getting work in because of this communication. Their parents could log into the account, they would look at it and they would see that I was right. There's, certain things missing. And oftentimes it would be something that could be fixed a lot sooner than later. Consider using an app like Remind, because what it does is it texts your message to the parent, or an email. Some parents prefer email. And cover all your bases so that you're sure that the parent is receiving your communication. Respond to parent questions and emails as quickly as possible. Oftentimes, being a parent as well as an educator, we have questions that we feel are really pressing, and we're hoping to hear back from the teacher as quickly as possible. So try to set up something that will work for you and try to be consistent about it. Maybe a 24-hour turnaround, 48-hour at most. If you have to check into something in order to respond to the email, let the parent know, give them a quick response that I'm going to look into this and I'm going to get back to you, and give them a date on that. And so oftentimes parents on the other end can feel like they're falling between the cracks in a digital environment where it's not face-to-face, and so we want to try to alleviate that, and that might be something that will help with that. Hold online office hours according to a schedule or by appointment or both, and also consider scheduling a Google Meet for parents to attend if you have something that needs to be discussed with all parents. Post a quick screencast if there's a sweeping issue with an assignment or a misunderstanding in the class, and try to get ahead of any challenges that come up by doing something like that. Parents will greatly appreciate it, and you will not get so many emailed questions. Grade and return work in a timely fashion, and I could go on and on and on. Audra, though, these parent tips are truly to help both parent and teacher, and of course I would expect that people find what's going to work best for them. But what are some other ideas on keeping things running smoothly?
So that brings us to our last tip, tip number 7, and it's to keep it simple. And I have to admit, and Ingrid can tell you, I am really not good at this one, but try to limit the number of platforms and digital tools that you are using in the classroom. My rule of thumb that I use for myself is between 3 to 5 tools total.
Why 3 to 5?
Well, I want to keep the learning in my classroom about that, the learning. We talked about all the modeling, going back to tip 2, that we really need to do. And we need to do that every time we introduce a new tool. We have to monitor that. So that takes up a lot of time that takes away from our instruction. And we just really can't afford to lose those minutes. So we have to be careful about where we're placing our time and how much training we're putting on technology versus teaching. Another reason to keep it simple is that many of these tools do the same thing. And this is a trap that I have fallen into. For example, formative assessment quizzing tools. There are so many out there. There's quizzes, Kahoot, Gimkit, Socrative. I could go on and on. But what I found is that a lot of these digital tools, they did the same thing. So what I had to do, even though they're all great and I love them all, I really had to narrow it down to one tool for one purpose. And that really helped my students get really good at navigating and using one tool instead of being just okay with 3 different tools at the same time.
So, okay, that's interesting, but what if students are not as excited about a tool any longer? The magic's worn off. What do you do?
That is a really good question. And I have to say that did happen to me last year. I love quizzes. So if you are a quizzes teacher out there, you're my people. And it's a formative assessment tool. But what I noticed is that by around December, my students were not as excited when I said it was a time for quizzes. That excitement, that magic you talked about had really worn off. And so what I decided to do was switch to Gimkit. It's also a formative assessment tool. And then bam, the excitement was back. Every classroom is different. Every group of students is different. So don't be afraid to change it up. But what I would recommend is don't use 2 of the same tools at the same time. Make sure each tool has a different purpose, and that will help you keep it simple for your students. Okay, so believe it or not, that was all 7 of our tips to getting ready to go digital. We really want to encourage you to take a look at this infographic that we've created to go along with this session. It really provides those 7 tips at a glance for you. It's something I would recommend that you print off and put by your computer, whether that's your virtual one at home or your computer desk at school, but really reflect on these tips throughout the year and ask yourself, how are you doing on those foundations of digital learning? So that's it for the tips. But if you have further questions, we would love to hear from you. So this is my email address as well as Ingrid's. Please feel free to email us. Give us a little time. We get a lot of emails. We will get to you. But if you have a question on anything we talked about today, please feel free to reach out to us. We also want to highlight the Nevada Digital Learning Collaborative website. This is where the resources will be posted. It's being updated all the time. It's something you're going to want to come back to throughout the year to take a look at all the things that are being provided for our teachers, our administrators, parents, and our students to really support you throughout the year.
So thank you for joining us, and be on the lookout each month as we will be releasing an interactive infographic on how to use Canvas with students, as well as tips for parents with Canvas parent accounts.